Could I have the first slide, please, Melissa? So when we're looking at documentation, there are lots of different angles to documentation, and I've tried to kind of stick some of them here. Can everybody see the slides okay? And can everybody hear me? Fine? That's good.
Yeah.
So we've got technical documentation, and there tends to be a couple of different angles to technical documentation, stuff that we use in development, and then there's other stuff that we use when we're wanting to help people to use what we've developed. And when we're dealing with the development documentation, there tends to be a few things that are fairly static. We set them up and they last pretty much throughout the project. And those are things such as policies, and policies relate to things like licenses and other things of that form. And then there are conventions, and these are things like naming conventions, style guides, and other things like that that run right the way through the project and really hardly change. But then we've got dynamic documents, and these are things that relate to issues and decisions. There might be diagrams in them and things like that. We also have got other things which are a little bit more lumpy than the issues and decisions, and these are things like milestones, version summaries, and so on. And again, we'll have visualizations for those. And sometimes the visualizations can be generated dynamically from the material that we've created. And other times what we do is take snapshots and have those accessible. But I'm sure that all of us can kind of recognize those types of documentation. When we come into using a product, then we tend to, again, have two sorts of documentation. One of them is a much more entry-level primer, and then we have other things which are where we begin to start looking at advanced techniques, specialist use cases, so on and so forth. Now, that's the technical stuff, but this would scare people who are wanting to look to solve a business need. And so we have other forms of documentation there, which are things like marketing overviews. Why should I bother using this? Or should I even know about this particular product, standard, service, or whatever? And then there are other things which help people make decisions about, do I use this or do I use that? So we have reviews that help people compare and contrast. And then we want to know, what can we use it for? So there are various other documents that we might have, which are usage scenarios, stories, and so on. And of course, these documents, I'm using the term very loosely. It could be that this is a video, a film, a cartoon, or what have you. Any ways to get the message through. So let's go to the next slide, Melissa, and we'll see where we are next. So with these sort of documentation types, there are also different tool sets and approaches for creating them. So I've categorized these as kind of three main chunks. And the first one tends to be small projects where you've got a user or creator who is really just doing their best efforts to document something. And we find that it could be a single file, a typical kind of README. Then we might have more complex documentation in the form of things like community wikis and so on. And in the specific area of ontologies, we've got certain tools that enable people very quickly to create some skeleton documentation. And these are things like Widoko, which is a combination of the web file and load tools. In some versions of Protege, you'll find OwlDoc and so on. And we'll be circulating these slides, so there are a few links there for you to go and take a look at. When we get groups that are a little bit more organized and they're kind of expected to be producing more authoritative documentation, a little bit more official stuff, and I'm talking about things like W3C, perhaps some university stuff, and so on. Then we find that documentation makes use of tooling, such as ByteShed or Respec, that there are certain publication rules that have to be passed before the publication goes forward. It also tends to be the case that we're looking here not just at the documentation surrounding the particular product, but also we're gathering together errata within the documentation. And then the other thing is that there tends to be, when we begin to move into this area, official translations of documentation. All of this tends to be done in ways that facilitate the more agile preparation of documentation. So ByteShed, for example, will work with Markdown, and it also enables the automated connection with GitHub issues and things like that. So it enables you, through the tooling, to pull together some fairly sophisticated documentation with the automated generation of indexes and so on. And that sort of thing is very, very helpful for teams. But the automated validation of documents according to things like publication rules and so on makes sure that the teams all work to a particularly high standard. And this is something that tends to be missing in the best efforts version above, even though it could be put in place if they wanted it, because actually something like Widoko is a very sophisticated tool that enables you to have quite detailed documentation. The other style of production comes with commercial standards organizations, where the documentation tends to be very difficult to work with, tends to be PDF or a book or something, and it's very often behind a paywall, because they're coming at it from a completely different angle. The product there, in part, is the documentation, and there tends to be more challenging licensing arrangements and so on. And so there are hurdles that they provide people with that you've got to jump, and they make it challenging to copy the documentation around, which is not what the other organizations are wanting to do. So the documentation there is actually a product rather than just something to make the product easier for people to use properly. And so the product itself then becomes part of a sales pitch that you would see from organizations like ISO, the BSI group, and others similar. Next slide then, please. So what have we got in GIST? So in GIST, we've got the web page, and we've got release notes that come both on the web and also packaged up with the download. The GitHub has got issues, and then there are different sorts of videos that provide information on GIST, some of which are curated on the Semantic Arts site as part of the GIST tutorials. But there's also a whole bunch of videos that include Estes Park videos and various other things like that within the YouTube channel. Then when we take a look at the GIST ontology itself, there's a certain element of inline documentation. We previously had RDFS comment, and now there's SCOS definitions. And there is also the style guide. There may have been other things that I've missed here, but that's the main chunk of what we have that I would consider to be documentation.
Is that
Peter,
is our style guide a dead link now?
At the
Yeah,
moment,
can I- no, well,
yes,
yeah, That exists now in the GitHub repository. The link is a bad link because it was auto-generated from a relative link in the release package, but you can find it in the gist repo under docs.
But it's something that I just said that so that when you go clicking around and you find a 404, it's so that everybody knows that we know about it and it's going to get sorted. Okay? Any questions at this point?
Yeah, don't we also have Widoko produced HTML documents?
We might have, but I haven't found them. I know we certainly do that in other organizations.
I thought we did. Boris or somebody else would know.
I mean, one of the things that we do have for visualizations is that within the download, there were some PNGs of how the different modules link to each other.
All right, never mind.
There's no Widoko in the release package.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's something we
Anyhow,
plan to be.
pretty much from this point on, if there are ideas that you have and things that you think we need to be considering, can you use that Google Doc to write away so that we've got them? Because the next bit of the presentation is really fairly interactive, and I'm pleased that people are beginning to start talking. So what I want to do next is to take a look at what I've found for us to have, and then take a look at where it might fit into the different purposes and of documentation. And then what I would like us to do is to have a conversation about how we can improve. Yeah, okay. Could somebody just put in the Google chat that tiny URL, or shall I do it? I might do it. Okay. Great, thanks very much, Dahlia.
Welcome.
Okay, so could we go then, Melissa, to the next slide? Now here, green means that we've kind of got it well covered, and amber means that we've got some partial stuff. And again, will have perhaps missed some of the things, but what I have down the left-hand side are the headings for the types and purposes of documentation. And going across the top, I've got the different things that I was able to find that you've just seen on the previous slide. So we do have the gist style guide, which kind of tells us about the conventions. We do have all the stuff that's in GitHub, which is to do with the issues and decisions. It also forms, to a great extent, the minutes of meetings that we have about gist, okay? And then in the web page, we've got a fair amount of stuff relating to marketing overviews. And the other amber ones, I feel that we've got stuff there. It's a start, but there are things that are, there's room for improvement, shall we say. The other challenge is that when we have something that's in a video, it's a fabulous way of presenting material, but it's not very searchable. The other thing about it is that it's pretty difficult to provide exact pointers to things. And the other thing is that people can't skim it in the same sort of way that they can with textual or diagrammatic forms of presentation. And so we have to think that whilst we're creating quite a lot of material covering many bases, in the videos that we've done, how impactful is that going to be outside of the actual time when the video was made? The other thing about documentation is that it's extremely helpful to have something definitive with a persistent link to it so that people can reference it. And so I think that there are a range of different needs that we have within the documentation that are still unfulfilled and could be placed in a better strategic position in order for us to provide a much more comprehensive view of GIST to a wide audience, so that we can increase the standing that it has within not just the academic community, which tends to talk about these things quite a lot, but the business community, so that it becomes something which is thought about in the same sort of ways in which people talk about SAP and Oracle and things like that. That when people are thinking about information, the GIST model as a basis for their enterprise architecture should be part of the vocabulary. So the way in which I think we need to do that is to take on board some of the routes that we have to generating documentation. And we've already had Michael thinking that we had some Widoko stuff, and we don't, but it would be very easy for us to get some Widoko generated material. I've started off doing something that would use the bike shed approach to give us some standard route to documentation. But I'm sure that you've all got experience that would be beneficial for this conversation. Can we look at the next slide, I think?
So Peter, can you go back
please.
one slide? I've noted in the doc, the Google Doc as well, in terms of policies, we do have a couple of other sources in the GitHub repository. We have a contributing file which explains how to submit issues, how to submit PRs, what they should look like, and what happens to them after you've submitted them. And there's also a change in release management document which sort of describes our overall process so that people understand, external contributors understand, you know, what we'll do when they get it. When they submit a PR or an issue, and how that goes into our workflow and so on.
Right, that's brilliant, and I'm sorry that I missed out. You and I did talk about it, but I didn't manage to trap it up into the slide. So thanks very much for putting that into the Google Doc. Can I move on to the next bit now? So this is really the discussion that I think we should have, but I'm very happy to change it if people think that the discussion should be along slightly different lines. But I think what we need to be looking at is what are the types of documentation that are desirable here for practitioners, and these are going to be really of two sorts. One of them is the existing GIST community, but the other is the future members of that community. How are we going to bring them in to the GIST community? And then for the business community and thought leaders, how are we going to extend the awareness of GIST? How are we going to describe how and where it's used? Not only in videos, but where we've got documents that they themselves can pick up and pass on to other people in order to promote something which they might have as an idea that's suited for their organization, and they want to they want to socialize that idea and get feedback within their organization. The next part is, how can we get documentation that will work well for us as part of a wider engagement strategy with thought leaders and so on. And then, as I mentioned before, where do we have the sort of definitive reference that people can point to, so that there's a fixed document. Right, so the conversation is starting. So Jonathan, would you like to talk a little bit about what you've just said? I know there's no need to talk. Okay, fine. Well, let me say it then. So Peter says, Jonathan says, Peter, this slide, the discussion is very good. I think all of these types of documentation are desirable, and I have wanted it. So he's very keen on this. The question is, how do we put this in place? What's the priority? What's the journey to doing this? And let me just have a look at how we're getting on with the right. Who would like to contribute?
Well, since everyone else is shy, to me, I think there's three sort of areas to look at. Two of them have to do with specific ontologies and GIST, specifically, and then one, and then there's a separate thing that's just about process standards, guidelines, etc. So we should probably keep those kind of separate. I mean, we do have process guidelines, standards, all that, which is good stuff. It's probably kind of independent of GIST, or certainly any specific version of GIST. But then we get to the ontology itself. Seems to me there's two things going on. One is the ontology itself, and you're right. We don't have the equivalent of schema.org or Widoku or anything. I mean, we should be able to see the ontology and have it as self-describing as possible. However, I'm pretty keen for that to be a live kind of thing sitting on top of a triple store rather than a HTML document. Although if we think it's going to be delayed any further, maybe we should have an HTML document. But it seems, and so we got process stuff. It's sort of in good shape. The ontology itself, which probably could be immediately in good shape with Widoku and in better shape with a live thing. The real action here, I think, is material that talks about the ontology, but it isn't the ontology. How to use it, how to think about it. And I mean, you're right. I happen to have the same feeling about videos. I hate videos personally. I never watch them. They're too tedious. But it seems like everybody else likes them, and that's why we put them out there. And if you listen to the web, which I never listen to, it says videos are the way to go. So it seems like most of our discussion is in this third category of saying things about GIST. And of course, that's the hardest thing also to keep current, because the ontology is evolving and what we said about it isn't. And, there's all those issues.
So I was going to say, the thing that I find most useful in documentation is seeing examples of things. So I watched the videos for the most part. When I went back and was trying to get myself integrated into GIST, I went there to look for okay, how do they do dates in GIST, right? And so I watched the date video and was just fast forwarding, trying to find a spot where I just saw some example triples on the screen. I was like, okay, that's the thing that I want to use. So one of the things that I've done at Olive is I made a property called example triple. Just for every property that I create, I put what I think at least one or multiple example triples that I expect to be made with that piece of vocabulary. And in general, I would just push, like, I think all documentation should have a single focal point, and inline is the best in my opinion. So if you've got videos, great. And the video talks about, universal date time or whatever, then put on the comment for universal date time, here's a URL for a video that's about this sort of thing, right? And that to me makes it easiest for, I'm looking at GIST, I'm gonna look at the inline comments first, and that can direct me out to a number of other places. Now that might be independent of the sort of the business cases. Maybe that doesn't belong in the ontology as much, I don't know, but those are the things I find most useful. And by far my biggest gripe with GIST, aside from some category stuff, but that's another conversation, is the comments being like not a standard format, some just fractions of sentences that don't disambiguate the things I might think the term means, and not knowing like what a practical example looks like. I've gotten way more value, I think, out of calling up Steve Stewart or coming through the videos and trying to find actual examples than looking in the comments themselves.
Those are great ideas.
So with a customer where we just finished some work, that's one of the things that we included in our deliverables. In addition to having the ontology and having all the standard SCOS annotations in it, we actually included sample RDF files that say, this is how you use this group of classes. This is how you use this group of classes. And we were able to deliver those instead of just having to try to have the developers try to read the ontology. We said, well, this is what you should expect the data to look like. This is how you should generate it. This is how you should use it. And they found it of great use. And so it wouldn't be a bad idea to try to think of that. Let's say we have a group of GIST classes that are intended to be used together. Things that used to be more groups and modules before, but let's say you show that these, let's say this related to agreements or whatever, they should be used together, formed in a particular manner. And then from each one of the concepts that participate in that example, whether they be classes or properties, you have a link to the document that demonstrates the use. That way it's embedded in the documentation. And it's easy to get to.
Yeah, Protege has that like pizza ontology that everybody goes back to look at. You can have the GIST equivalent, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, Boris. That it's very often these little small constellations that you have to combine together. But how did you actually embed that in the ontology, or was it a kind of a standalone thing?
We had a separate directory.
Yeah.
We had the directory where the ontology was, the directory where the taxonomy was, and then we had an examples directory. And the examples directory just had standalone RDF files, and then each one demonstrating the sort of a group of related concepts. Here's how we intend them to be used.
Yeah. No, that's good.
In fact, it was critically important strategy in developing the ontology extension. So we'd have a little extension, hey, we need to do X, Y, or Z. And then the three of us, Boris and myself and the client, we would just go back and forth and send files back and forth with triples. And finally we'd say, okay, these are the triples we want. And then we'd do the ontology from there. And then we'd write the Tarkle to generate the triples and whatnot.
Yeah.
That was all. It just kind of evolved there. I hadn't done it that way before, but it worked well.
No, that's good. How many examples did you have?
Maybe a handful, 5, 10, 20 sometimes. It depends. You just need a representative example.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you can generate, it doesn't have to be exhaustive.
Right.
But if you can generate a some kind of a relatively representative use, then most people can infer from there. But sometimes, especially because of the fact that GIST is no longer modular and the standard serialization is alphabetic, related concepts are usually not really adjacent to each other anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And those kind of focused, kind of a domain specific examples help glue the related concepts together.
Yeah, that's good.
Um,
How many examples? Go ahead, Rebecca.
No, I think it's a great idea what Boris is describing, but one has to be very conscious of the maintenance issue in order to make these documents stay in sync, and that would be an advantage of sort of a Java doc style, where they could be embedded directly in the ontology file, though I guess serializers will wipe out comments. I'm not quite sure how that would work. But anyway, it's a risk that you have to be conscious of, that those documents need to be kept in sync.
Yeah, that definitely is. It's additional maintenance, and it's a burden on those that are doing code reviews to make sure that if you substantially change something, that you make sure that you update the documentation in sync. But really, it's the same kind of issue with JavaDoc, because it's fairly easy to let class and method documentation drift away from the implementation. So it's I think it's a worthwhile thing, and if you have the make sure that you annotate your concepts, classes, and properties with links to where the example data is, then anybody reviewing changes to those classes and properties can also make sure that that documentation is updated.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I agree with this, Boris, because the other thing is that what we can then do is parse the ontology and pop that into some markdown automatically, and that could include the hooks to GitHub if we were to include in the annotations things like relevant GitHub issues where this was either discussed or where the particular components of the ontology came from, because that can all be done automatically in the generation of a document if you've got a hook that allows it to be done.
Right, absolutely.
And I think that the consideration of the automation, the other thing is that we don't have to put up with all the automation that we see. We can take it and adapt it to our specific needs. And that then gives us the possibility of having our own pub rules, our own sort of way of validating the document as a part of the automated build. And I see this as being something that is part of how we are working towards sysops. The documentation, including some examples and all that sort of stuff, could be part of the design and the coding process, but it should be done in such a way that the sysops automation can pull it out and concentrate it in a primer or concentrate it in a class-by-class walkthrough that can then perhaps be annotated in a bit more detail, but all the donkey work having been done by the sysops pipeline, the SemOps pipeline.
Well, there's also a little bit of a point here. There seems like a big continual thought that there's this initial artifact that gets built into the ontology as opposed to actually just having the ontology that you work on.
Build the ontology.
Well, like right now, you can't go to our GitHub repo and look at the ontology.
downloaded. I'm not sure what you
It has to go through a build process before you get.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Whereas, so it's kind of this mindset that we're still in the world of files.
Yep.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of my concern too. I would love to just have it in a triple store, and there's some things to add here, like whenever we know that a concept is described in a video, RDFC also, and then just point to the video. That's it. But that could just be in the ontology rather than separate. The fact that everything is separate now is part of the issue. And then, what Casey was saying about examples, he's got very atomic ones, but you could do the same thing. And if you had a constellation like Boris was talking about, like let's say you had the constellation of here's how we recommend you do addresses. It's a relationship between a person and an address with a communication preference in between or something. And so you refer to about 3 classes and 2 properties. It's a little bit of extra work, but if you put that link in those 3 classes and 2 properties to say, here's an example, and that's probably not the only, certainly not the only place person is used. Person will have a link to here's how we do addresses, here's how we do employees, here's, whatever those patterns are. But yeah, I think that would be helpful.
So Dave, this is really a good conversation. Everybody's been chipping in. We've got 10 minutes left in order to actually create our skeleton plan of where we need to go, what we need to do. So there are certain quick wins that we've already discussed to do with things like putting something together in either a Widoka or a similar sort of way. What's the appetite for that? Do people think that that's something that we should do? Or do you think that we should be putting more effort into arriving at the extended slow reveal tool or something similar?
I'm going to defer to Jamie. Jamie, how far do you think we are from having a, I don't know, Budoku style or a DBpedia style UI on top of a triple store, such that the publication process would be put the ontology in a triple store and then view it, as opposed to generate HTML?
So actually working on some of this right now to allow us basically to have public, basically a public interactive as well as, batch download, if you want, of directly from the triple store that can link, that can have an interactive UI to browse the ontology, like the Wikipedia, as well as to be able to link directly into slow reveal presentations, basically to describe how to use different parts of GIST.
Right.
As well as we haven't focused on this as much, but slow reveal does have the concept of instance data, but that could actually probably be expanded a little bit more to have real instances versus kind of its fake instances.
Yeah.
But you can generate the real instance data and then use it in your presentation.
So this would cover the stuff that is with the first bullet in my discussion slide, which is for existing GIST community, really.
Right.
How would it deal with it being the reference to point to? Would we have a definitive URI that is like, here's the GIST document that would be kind of generated rather than people having to page through?
Well,
or are we needing something different from that?
Well, the definitive URL is https://ontology.semanticarts.com/gist.
And would that be the reference in the same way that people point to? So could we use content negotiation, for example, to give the HTML document or the turtle file?
Yep.
Okay, so that would be a good way of covering that. What do we do about articles or some overview for future members of the GIST practitioner community? Because they aren't going to go digging deep into something until they know that there's a good reason to do that. So they need to have something that tells them at a technical level what GIST is about, how and where it can be used within their work, and how they can join the community.
Yeah, we got that exact request just yesterday. I mean, it's very fresh. I don't think we have anything quite like that.
No, I don't think we do. So how can we get that? I think that in the next 8 minutes or so, if we can get a pointer to that as to how we would do it, Michael, that would be really, it looks as though that is something that's high on the list, and it will be fairly easy to deliver.
So remind me, but we go back and forth. What specific thing would be high on the list, easy to deliver?
Yeah, let me tell you what the request was yesterday. So we're having a second call with a prospect. Actually, there's two people in this pharmaceutical company, one of whom has been a fan of GIST for a long time. They've based their ontologies on it, but not importing it. He said we've used it to learn from, which is great. This other person, I think, is his boss, who doesn't know GIST, isn't as deep into ontologies, but liked the whole message and said, "Is there anything you can send me?" I forgot how he put it, but essentially give me the gist of GIST.
So there's a couple of ways to do that. One is to have a document, maybe a 20 or 30 page document that introduces everything. Another one, a more grandiose idea, would be to write a book, a short 80 to 100 page book to describe GIST from tip to tail with examples and everything else. I had that in the back of my mind.
Yeah, I think this guy's probably looking at a 5 or 10 page, but you're right. It's author. What's different about this than what we were talking about earlier is this is a pure authoring thing as opposed to generating it from the artifact itself. I don't think you could generate this from GIST.
Technical books like that really go out of date so fast. I'm so tired of a series of technical books that I bought where now I have to buy edition 2 and 3 and 4 as the thing evolves. So I'd not be in favor of a book per se.
The barrier to entry with books is huge unless you're giving them away.
Barrier to entry? You mean someone has to pay?
If I've got to pay $40 for a book just so that I can find you, I want something that's like a long magazine article.
Yeah.
I think generating or writing a sort of pattern guide, modeling guide that could be included in the release package would be a good idea.
Yes, I agree, but that's going for the more sophisticated thing, which is what I had right at the beginning for practitioners with the the primer and the advanced patterns.
Right.
Okay, but these are kind of like for existing GIST users who want to improve their skills, but future members of the community want to know, why should I bother with GIST when I've got BFO or I've got Dolce or something like that? Okay.
Well, that could be an introduction in such a manual, I suppose.
Yeah. So I think that this is something that we could put a little bit of effort into and get something out of it that would be helpful fairly quickly. The other things that are in this list are to do with business awareness of GIST. And to some extent, I think that this requires us to be focusing on magazine articles almost. Now, people don't go flying around and reading magazines on airplanes, but there are different specialist professional press where people get the idea of here's something that they should actually ask their technical team to go and investigate because it might solve the business problem that they've got. And I'm not sure that this is an area that we touch at all. But the question about it is what are the routes through beyond the technical specialists in enterprises? You know, how do we get to the thought leaders? How do we write appropriately for the magazines, really, and things like that they read?
Somehow my prototype of the magazines these people read, the National Lampoon once did this takeoff of an industrial magazine, and it was called Sludge, the magazine of, and it had an oil spill coming out of a thing, and the whole magazine was as if it was written to, you know, people in sludge. But what I liked on the back was they had a thing that said, you know, don't be fooled by our competitors. And they had a little inset of the magazine. It was the exact same picture with a mirror image, and but it was called Gunk, the magazine of sludge.
Yes, absolutely.
We have to shoot for what kind of article would you put in Sludge, the magazine of gunk, about GIST? That's a stretch, you know?
So maybe you'd be looking for something that's like something that would feed a little article in like the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or something like that.
Yep.
So for example, we have the Data-Centric Architecture Forum. Normally speaking, when you have something like that, you would put out press releases. In a press release, you would then have notes for editors, because these people who are putting out these journals are looking for copy. We need to have stuff that gets pipelined out so that they can do the job for us, but they need the right words to say, where it is a quotation, Dave McComb, president of Semantic Arts, said, blah, 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 okay? And other stuff like that. So this is where we take bits of stuff that we have about GIST, about its usage, about the benefits of it, about how we can lead to a data-centric architecture, how that's the best thing since sliced bread for any enterprise that's wanting to enter the 21st century with vigor. And then they can take it from there. But unless we've got these snippets and materials and that they get pushed out to the major news organs via the standard channels, it'll never happen.
Okay, we're at the top of the hour.
So what I'm saying is that part of the documentation is this business about thinking about it as a part of a broader engagement strategy that isn't to do with the technical stuff, but it has to tell you a lot about GIST and why you should engage your technical staff with it.
We're at the top of the hour. Let's kind of recap. I think the thing that bubbled up to the top was to have a short article about why gist, right? That's the
Mhm.
one missing thing. I think the second thing to me that bubbled up was the idea of having these standalone, instance-based examples of constellations of classes, and if we could have a annotation in the ontology that pointed back to these things,
Mhm.
I think, and then the idea of just RDF-SC also pointing from classes and properties to YouTube videos. I guess the other one is we either have to decide on in the short term Widoko or getting our triple store viewer up to speed.
Mhm.
I don't think it should be either or there, Dave. The Vidoko could always have a role for people who are convenient and like that modality.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, Widoko or the handlebars thing. So we've got 5 actions in the Google Doc. People have got the link. They can always come into it later on and add stuff.
I have a question. Casey suggested the idea of putting an actual triple inline in the documentation. Did you mean something in literally internal syntax, Casey? Or just in English saying, you know, Joe Schmo is the CEO of, you know, Google Doc or Google, whatever. Is Casey still on?
Michael.
Casey's off the call.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Regarding Widoko, I mean, it's low-hanging fruit, right? It doesn't, why not just stick it in there until we have something better?
Yeah, that's true.
Yep.
Good. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thank you, Peter, for putting this all together.
Thank you. That was thought provoking. Thank you.